Welcome to Let's Play Rule the Waves 3 as Germany starting in 1935. It's 1947 and I've just finished a major battle in the Western approaches, and to my mind, I really didn't do that well. And what happens to admirals, certainly in the British tradition, is that there is a board of inquiry held. Senior admirals, often ones who have previously held the command that you have, will sit in judgment of your performance. And yeah, for me, I got a victory, but it could have been so much better. If we have a little look at the results, apologies again for having a rush of blood to the head and not actually looking at the ship results in detail. Here was our force balance. So pretty equal, 4-5 in battleships and battlecruisers, 5-4 in carriers. Yes, the British had a big advantage in light carriers, and you can see those 6 light carriers is either 2 or maybe even 3 carrier equivalents, depending on how many planes they have. I had a big advantage in cruisers, light and heavy, although I wasn't aware of that at the time. There was a great deal of misreporting, and there were a lot of ships variously reported as cruisers or indeed carriers, which turned out to be merchant ships or heaven knows what. But I wasn't aware of that. And equality in destroyers, and of course the British were protecting a convoy of 20. The losses, I sank a battleship, the British sank 2 cruisers, pretty much the same number of destroyers and 8 transports. Pretty equal, but with certainly the preponderance for Germany, hence the German victory. Plus, as a bonus, the air losses were more than twice as severe for the British as they were for the Germans. So the result, the game judged, was a minor victory with a prestige point. Well, thank you very much. However, I think it's reasonable to argue that a bigger victory was to be had. If we think about it, I should have pressed home and sunk the HMS Centurion battleship, which was heavily damaged, despite the fact that I was running low of ammunition. I think that's a reasonable case to make. I was unable to exploit the cruiser advantage that I didn't know I had, in part because the Centurion rushed north and interceded between the convoy and my advancing cruisers and roughed up my heavy cruisers and indeed materially helped to sink the Rune. Outside of my control, the air attacks, despite being expert and veteran air crews, didn't sink a major ship. What was all that about? Repeated air attacks. Not one British ship, big ship, was sunk. I was also hampered by problems with the beta that I'm using. Well, that kind of goes with beta territory, but it did mean I couldn't shape the air attacks as I wanted, and in particular, it meant that I couldn't use guided missiles in the attack, which was a great shame. And then finally, as I've mentioned, despite having air searches, air attacks, reporting, visual sighting, and radar sighting of the enemy, the level of misreporting was really extensive, despite the weather conditions being, pretty fine. Loads of carriers were misreported, loads of light and heavy cruisers were misreported during the battle, very confusingly. Now, there were some successes. So, number one, let's give a big shout out to the gunnery officers of the battlecruisers. My 4 battlecruisers only received light damage. Britain's 5 had 1 sunk, 1 heavily damaged, I'm going to argue nearly sunk, and 3 others with light damage. So that was pretty good. And then my fighters were exceptional. So as a cap, they kept German air losses to only 37% of the Royal Navy's air losses. And many Royal Navy airstrikes were aborted with heavy losses, both on the battlecruiser force and on my carrier force as well. Some of you had mentioned that it's often quite difficult for the for the carriers to launch and maintain a cap over the battlecruiser force, but that actually seemed to work pretty well. In addition to fighters in defense, fighters in offense as escorts meant that my torpedo bomber losses were only 17% of my total torpedo bombers were 38% of British ones were lost. So really keeping down my torpedo bomber losses. And my dive bomber losses were a bit less than German dive bomber losses. And Royal Navy fighter losses were double those of my fighter losses. So both in defense and attack, my fighters did an epic job, despite the fact that I failed to deploy my new, shiny, light jet fighters onto the carriers coming soon. Now, you may say perhaps I'm being too hard on myself, or this sort of thing wouldn't really happen. Well, let's go have a look at a historical precedent first, before then I lay out the reasons why I think it's fair to offer you a vote. Should I be relieved of command? Should I be privately censured? Or should I be exonerated? Is going to be your choice. So, first of all, the historical precedent. Similar event, a convoy attack battle during the Battle of Cape Spartivento. Now, in this, a British force under James Somerville and an Italian force under Inigo Campioni met. Somerville was trying to protect a convoy that was headed to Malta. The reason the convoy was being run was this was only a matter of days, maybe 2 weeks or something, after the British attack on Taranto. So most of the Italian battle fleet was either sunk or heavily damaged and would be out of operation for months to come. And Campioni was in charge of the only 2 battleships that were unscathed at Taranto. Somerville's excuse for this engagement being a bit desultory and certainly not in any way decisive was, well, first of all, he had a slower battle fleet. He had with him Ramillies, an unmodernized Jutland-era Revenge class or R-class battleship, stuck to 20 knots or 21 knots theoretically, that was significantly slower than, well, actually pretty much everything else at sea that day aside from the merchant ships. And he had Renown. Now, Renown was a much modernized battlecruiser, but Renown's 6 15-inch guns were significantly outgunned by Veneto Vittoria's 9 15-inch guns from an excellent battleship, supported by Cisarguglio, which had the 12.6-inch guns, pretty light, but at least it had speed to keep up in a way that Ramillies couldn't. Somerville also had to protect the Malta convoy, which restricted his freedom of movement to a degree. So Somerville, assisted by Lancelot Holland, who was in charge of the cruiser force, did the best they can to shield the convoy against a much more nimble force. Churchill was enraged that this wasn't a victory. Churchill thought every time you meet the enemy, it should be a decisive victory for the Royal Navy, and wanted him replaced. There was an inquiry and a lot of representation from other admirals who said, no. Particularly strong support from Andrew Cunningham at the other end in the Mediterranean Fleet, saying, no, Somerville was doing a great job in Force H. Lancelot Holland was exonerated as well. He went on to become Vice Admiral battlecruisers, flying his flag in HMS Hood. Didn't go so well for him later on. Poor old Holland. For the Italians, Campioni's excuses were that he had been explicitly ordered by Supermarina to avoid battle unless he had a decisive superiority, and he argued that 2 battleships of his against 2 battleships of the British was not a decisive superiority. However, it transpired that this was possibly one of the best opportunities the Italians had to overwhelm a smaller, slower British force, and that his extensive cruisers under Angelo Icciano, who was to very soon replace Campioni, should have done better. And indeed, Somerville kept his job, and Campioni did not. So that, if you like, is an example of how an indecisive engagement can cause the commanders on both sides to be questioned. So the question for you is, should I be relieved of command? The case for the prosecution is, I think, that I allowed a greater victory to slip through my fingers. At the very least, HMS Centurion should have been sunk. I failed to protect the heavy cruisers when Centurion went north to tackle them. I should have both responded with my battle cruisers chasing after to get its attention. They did do that, but after a gap. And I should have pulled back my heavy cruisers until the threat from Centurion had been dealt with. Number 3, I withdrew too early, despite shells, bombs, and torpedoes all still being available to fire at the enemy. And number 4 is I did not completely destroy the convoy. Yes, I caused a significant number of losses, but a significant number, a majority indeed, got through. Under all of those points, I think that's actually quite a powerful argument to say, well, you may have done well, but you didn't do well enough, and you should be relieved. Didn't show enough aggression. Or you may think that I should be privately censored, recognize that I did achieve a victory, recognize that I didn't lose any capital ships far, far away from German bases, but also that a greater victory had been set up and I failed to capitalize on that opportunity, and I should do better. Obviously, if I was to receive a censure, I would tender my resignation, and that probably would be refused because it's wartime and you can't just walk out of a command when you feel like it. No flouncing for admirals, oh no. Thirdly, you may feel that you want to completely exonerate me. First of all, I achieved a significant success, a prestige success, despite not having an overall majority against the Royal Navy. Secondly, the Graf Spee was down to 16% of its ammunition, and the other 3 battlecruisers were under 30%, as well as beginning to run short of anti-aircraft ammunition. Thirdly, I was hampered and limited by misreporting systemically across the board, particularly misreporting that Centurion was sinking. There was a long period of time when I repeatedly checked on Centurion and it repeatedly said that Centurion was sinking. Must have been a miracle of damage control to get it to limp back home. Secondly, I was limited by the Beta 32 forbidding me to have proper control over my air attacks. Thirdly, although I mounted a great many air attacks, their results were very poor. And fourthly, I was conscious that I was a long way from home, and any ship damaged would have to face a perilous and difficult journey that may have increased damaged ships into sunk ships. So, have a think. Those are the choices. Here is the vote that is going to be posted as soon as I post this video. Don't hold back. Indeed, don't worry. If you relieve me, I'll only be replaced by a more capable, more handsome and better spoken version of myself. Me. New and improved and slightly chastened from how aggressive, unaggressive you should be in a battle, and resolved to do better next time. So, that's my little Christmas present to you. Enjoy. Vote now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time, where I'll be further reflecting on the battle and reorganizing the fleet to make it a more agile organization for the battles to come. Bye for now, and happy Christmas and New Year to you all.